Hello. I've been moving pretty fast in the last few days and arriving on this live. Hello. Oh, it's so sweet to see people's faces and names that I recognize. Shelley and Helen and Judith. And I knew I wanted to begin by slowing down. And some of that is this is like the bridge into this idea around practice. One part of that is personal practice, the importance of me slowing me down. And then this is an example of how these relate. Hi, Nadia. Is that there's a way that this can also be interpersonal. And I know we're not in the same room, and I don't even really get to see your faces. I get to see like your little bubble images. But this is interpersonal. And I think, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think that's something that we have to take into account as humans in this particular age, is that there are these other realms of interconnection and connection that in some way have always been available, but in different formats. And now we have them like Facebook and Zoom video conferences, and just what are the myriad FaceTime, what are sort of these myriad ways where the interpersonal comes into play. So one piece of that is the recognition of the way that we impact each other. So I know that my slowing down, my breath impacts me, but I also know that it impacts you. So then it becomes an interpersonal piece. So, with all that said, I think I'll start just actually by saying that it's my intention. A lot of these pieces have been moving through me in different ways over time, and for whatever reason right now there's a coalescing, and I really have a strong impulse to share about what I believe is the purpose of practice, the value of practice. What do I even mean by practice? The importance of different aspects, like to be distinguishing this word. I think I'm going to grab another book to lift you all up just another notch higher. Okay, hold on. I don't want to make anybody seasick here. Okay, there, I just put you at just a little bit higher level. So again, this is a little bit of a tangent, but one of the things that's so interesting to notice the way that different pieces will come. It's like, I don't even think they practice is not new, right? Practice is, even as a word, it's not new. Certainly as a concept, it's not new in any way, shape, or form. The same way that things like authenticity and embodiment and the divine feminine or whatever, there are catchphrases that arise within the culture that kind of become hot at different times, and that's beautiful. It's just like nothing bad. I mean, not that nothing bad can come from, but really it's basically an overall plus positive or benefit that authenticity is more of a catchphrase than it was 15 years ago when I first started doing authenticity work, right? One of the challenges is that we can start using catchphrases and sort of forget to dial into, what do we really mean by this phrase? What is this word or phrase or sort of catch-all? What does it mean? And so I think also as like practice is like hitting a certain wave. It's like surfing a wave within the culture right now. I have this desire to share more about where I come from when I use that word, why I use that word, why I love practice, and just give a little more nuance to it. So I have, like 7 different topics I want to talk about. I'm going to try to keep these just a little bit shorter. And so I'm going to stick as much as I possibly can in this Facebook Live today to specifically breaking down these 4 areas that I would say. And I think there's really an intersection. When I was writing even just the title, right, 4 essential types of practice for wholeness, I almost wrote embodied wholeness. And then I was like, oh, fuck. Like, then we bring in the axes, right? These are the axes, the Y and the X. I don't know which is which. I actually just recently found on my phone, in the internet, like on the phone, the little, open up, and I have, of course, like 24 pages like open that I saved for some reason, or I opened, or I wanted to go back to, or I opened and forgot. And one of them, I was going through and just clearing them. I was like, oh my God, the clutter that I have in this kind of E dimension. And one of them, I had done a Google search when I was doing homework with my son, and the Google search was, which axis is the Y axis? Because I think we had to graph something out, and I was like, I don't remember. So anyway, we have these axes. And embodiment for me runs through all of this, but I don't want to get derailed by that completely. I still want to just be able to break down, frankly, I think these 4 types of practice are essential even without embodiment. I just think embodiment's essential for any kind of true transformation in this realm, because we are born into bodies. So that's I've talked about that a lot. I will continue to talk about it. But this plays out regardless. So the 4, as I would name them, are what we might call, I gave myself different language for these, so I just want to, so there's different ways to name these. One is, I would say, there's like personal or solo practice. And then there's what I would call relational or interpersonal. And then there's relationship to earth, or practices that are connected to the earth in some way. I would call that sort of place-based or earth-based practice. And then the 4th is God, source, the divine. In a way, I would call these are all relational practices. And that's how it first starts. So another way that I would name these 4 is relationship to self, relationship to other, relationship to the earth, and relationship to God or source or the divine, whatever word works for you. And then the way that I wrote it this morning was similar. It was like connection to self is individual or personal practice, connection with other. And I use the word with there very intentionally, because honestly, the first one could be that too, connection with self. I say connection to self, but a lot of times I want to connect to the other rather than with the other. But true relational or interpersonal practice is connection with other. So connection with self, individual, personal practice, connection with other or others, right? Relational or interpersonal practice, connection with the earth or earth. I would call that land or place-based practice, connection with source, God, the divine. And that, I would call that cosmic practice. In a way, when I was looking at this, I wanted to call it spiritual. And this is one of the tricky things about talking about distinguishing these, is that they do overlap. In some way, all of these practices are spiritual. So I got a little hung up on calling it that. But it's a cosmic practice that I would say goes beyond self and other, right? And it goes beyond even this particular planet. So beyond earth practice. I've heard other people talk about, I've been talking about this probably for 15 years. Part of it started for me is because I grew up in a Buddhist monastery. And so I was surrounded by people who were doing very deep personal or solo practice, even though we were together, we were living, in very, very close quarters. And I also spent my kind of early adulthood from the ages of 19 to 21 at that same monastery. And so of course there's some interpersonal stuff going on. But one of the things that I think elevates things to the space of practice versus either just what's happening or even habit, and I'll go into that in a little bit, is intentionality. So even though we were living in the monastery, there's a lot of interpersonal relational stuff going on. A lot of it wasn't very conscious, even if it was sort of conscious like internally, but it wasn't made conscious in the interpersonal realm. That wasn't the focus of practice. There were very few practices that actually brought conscious attention to the interpersonal realm. And so that was one of my first kind of sparks of like, whoa, this thing called practice actually has different realms, because here I am seeing, you know, a whole community, a whole body of people with so much dedication to practice. We would call it practice. We'd have practice discussion. We had practice groups, you know, all these, and we were getting up at, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning and going to sit meditation. And, you know, there were so many forms and practices. And yet I also saw the way that it didn't just naturally transition over into the interpersonal realm per se. So that sort of began that inquiry for me. And then I spent many years, and I'm still doing this to this day, but really like diving very deeply into what was the interpersonal, what was the relational realm of practice. And one of the things that I started to see is that, you know, again, this is kind of a pendulum swing thing, or this is like a cyclical thing that'll happen. But I was also, you know, I not only created, but then was deeply involved in communities where relational and interpersonal practice was like the total jam. And a lot of times what happened was that personal or solo practice kind of like fell off their radar. Or it wasn't elevated to the same degree. It was like, no, this is really where it's at, you know, throughout like old style practice is that solo business. And now we have a new, better practice, which is interpersonal. And so I started to see like, oh, there's a little, something, it's like, yes, there's something really important with that. But like, if we lose the personal practice, then there's like a little quirk there. And then it's over time. I mean, so then, you know, the one that I see added by people a lot is then connection to source or God or the divine. So spiritual practice. And then I would say, you know, in some way I've always had this, which is part of why I think it took me a long time to distinguish it as a separate practice. But again, to go into the realm of then what people would call more like connection to the divine, spiritual practice, relationship with source, like that part of practice, cosmic practice, is that you'll also see inside sort of self-proclaimed or objectively spiritual communities that sometimes other pieces get lost. I mean, it was very interesting to, yeah, where sometimes it's this, like in a lot of spiritual communities, there is a lot of solo practice, but sometimes there's a loss of what I would call then the practice of like relationship with self can get lost. Sometimes there's even rules about like not practicing yoga or not journaling or, you know, these things which are other ways of connecting with self, even though there might be consistent solo practice, which is more about like connecting to the divine or spiritual practice. Or then in some way people coming together in groups, but sort of coming together in this like specific way. In some ways, I've definitely seen this. I don't want to say this is true about all communities like this, but communities of plant medicine where there's a coming together, and then there's a lot of this connection to divine, connection to source, like spiritual practice, regular ceremony practice, and yet sometimes very little like self-reflection or solo practice outside of the ceremony space, and also very little work on the actual relational or interpersonal realm outside of ceremony space. And then I think something's lost. I've often seen, I've never like really gotten deeply, deeply involved in any of those ceremony communities, but I've been very, very close with people who have. And a lot of times when I dive into kind of what's missing for them, or what are the, maybe chronic complaints, it has to do with sort of people's loss of personal integrity, or not really having a way or a space or practices to work out our earthly interpersonal relationships, like just like human to human. There's like shit going down that doing this spiritual work or being in ceremony together only impacts some aspects, and then there's like, hey, like human to human, yeah, sure, God's always involved, but like right now, do we have the practices to be with each other or talk to each other or communicate in a way that actually works and heals, like on the human level, which is super important because we're humans. In case anyone forgot, in the last 20 years or so. That's how we got born. Yes, we are also connected to spirit, but we didn't get born as spirits. I don't even know if spirits are born, right? And we didn't get born as animals, and we didn't get born as plants, and like we didn't get born as cosmic stars. We may have been cosmic stars in the past, I don't know, but we got born as humans. So in the human realm, there is absolutely interpersonal practice. It's just necessary. It's totally, absolutely necessary. And then, so what I was going to come around, even though I named this as third, I'm coming around to it fourth. And this is the one I was naming, is that in some way, I think this has always been present for me, is connection to earth. So it took me a long time to really go like, no, there is a fourth leg to this table or stool. There are three-legged stools. So I could use this analogy of like personal practice, interpersonal practice, and spiritual practice or connection to God, and be like, yeah, it's a three-legged stool. And if one leg gets really short, or if you're missing one leg altogether, like stool's just not going to stand, can't hold your weight. It's like a wonky stool. But what I think I've realized is that it's more like it's like a table or a chair. Like it's more solid than that, and it has four legs. And earth-based practice is also essential. And now that may mean the things that you might think of when I say earth-based or land-based practices, right? That have to do with literally connecting to earth, or spirit animals, or sweat lodge, or what you think of like the indigenous peoples of the land on which you live, like what were their earth-based practices? Yes, that. And I also mean having a regular, conscious way that you make connection to the place in which you live, to the actual land on which you live on, which may very well include connecting in some way to who are all the peoples who have been on the land before you, or what land did you come from before you came to this land, which again might be like, well, I moved from Minnesota, and before that we were in New York, and before that my family was in Canada, and before that, and you can go very, very far back, right? Like the farthest back I think my family, at least on one side, can trace is a small village in kind of northeastern Germany. And I personally believe that there's actual value in like kind of following our bloodline. There's our family of choice, super, super important, but there is our family of blood, and that actually is how we incarnated. And that family of blood has place throughout time, like it is located in place and time. And it might be like 1,000 years ago we were here, and then we were here, and then we were here, and this line, took this route, and this line took this route, and this is where, for me, for instance, I think this is another reason why it took me a while to come to this, is that I have lived in Northern California my entire life. And I recently found out that on my paternal grandmother's side, so my father's mother, and following her lineage back, I am a 6th generation Northern Californian. That makes my children 7th generation Northern Californian. They were born in Northern California. I was born in Northern California. My father was born in Northern California. My grandmother and her parents and their parents, they were born and lived in Northern California. I have a great uncle who died on Mount Shasta when my grandmother was a young child, right? Like that's deep land-based fact. I don't know what else to call it, like experience. And so, but there is something that's deeply important about these. So that's just giving the lay of the land. And I'll kind of go back through this, but I want to just really quickly, for those of you who have joined, so the 4 basic types, without going into like then the axes, and that within every type there's body practices, devotional practices, mantra practice, like there's different practices within each of these and different flavors of each of these. But what I see as like the fundamental types that are essential for our wholeness, that are essential to actually move in some way, not consecutively, concurrently, are what I would call relationship with self, or personal or solo practice. What I would call relationship with other, interpersonal, relational practice. What I would call relationship with earth, land-based, place-based practice. And what I would call relationship with divine, God, practices around God, practices around the divine source, like the ways in which you connect to that. So those are the 4. And it is truly, again, so I've been involved in communities, and I have known people who have been very, very involved in communities that put an enormous amount of emphasis on the land-based practice. And I think all of them, really what I think it is about wholeness. And so over time, people will be like, oh, I grew up, maybe it's like I grew up with no practice, or, only going to church, and you were just supposed to do whatever God told you to or something. So then I realized like how important my personal practice is. And I found meditation, and they're like, fuck that spiritual practice over there. And then I found that there was ceremony, and then I found no. And there's sort of like, I think what we've been trying to do culturally in some way is find this wholeness. I think it's found in all 4. So there's been a real upsurgence. Again, it's not because it's new. This is not new. I think it's our way of trying to find wholeness and experience wholeness. But there's been this real upsurgence of really looking at, well, who were the indigenous people who lived on this land before I lived on this land? What is that history? What are the indigenous skills of the people in my bloodline? Or what are the indigenous skills of the people who lived on the land before my people lived on the land? What does it mean to be connected to earth? What are actual earth survival skills, right? And there's a thread of this. Probably some of you have been involved in this for a long time, but there's like this big kind of upsurging into the more mainstream consciousness. And again, I've seen inside those communities that then sometimes what I might call interpersonal practice gets lost, or sometimes spiritual practice. They're like, no, it's all about the land. Like, we don't talk about God. Or some of those real self-reflective practices get lost. And really in any community I've seen, I've been, I don't know, blessed. I've been lucky enough to really touch on a lot of this throughout my whole life, given that my life began in a community of practice, and I've really followed that in my life. And it's one of the reasons, again, I'll say this is a personal bias of mine. I believe that what we choose as our practices, in some way that's saying, what am I devoted to? What do I offer my devotion to? Including, again, myself inside of that. And how do I offer it? This is ultimately what makes what makes our life up. I don't want to say determines the value of our life, but it's like literally, it's moment to moment. This is the experience of life we get to have. And so the more, and not as a form of perfection, like, oh my God, you're never allowed to like Netflix binge, or you're never allowed to like, it's just having this rhythm, this consistency of what are the practices that hold me? What do I know I can count on, as I rise in the morning, or as I meet the day, or as I eat my food, or as I walk outside, or as I end my day, or as I relate to the people in my life, or as I like, how do I bring this in? I'm going to do a whole other live on sort of distinguishing between and the relationship between also. You know, consistent practice, small consistent practice, and the way that that ultimately becomes ongoing practice. So there's value in that, but I don't want to get derailed by my own mind right now and focus on these four. So now again, it may be that you don't have a billion hours in the day to start with, and then you have many things that call your attention and take your time and energy, and like, oh fuck, like I thought I could just have like a meditation practice, and now you're telling me I not only have to have a meditation practice, but I have to have a relational practice, and I also have to figure out something with God, and then get outside and touch the earth every day. Like, who's got time for this shit? And I'll just say, I didn't say at the beginning, but always I love your questions, your shares, your reflections. So if you're being quiet because I don't know, because you think you have to, like, don't. Please bring in your own questions, shares, anything that you see to add nuance to this. So I'm not really saying that. And so there may be times in your life when it's like, okay, well, I need to bring a little bit more of this in. I can see this is where I've been a little bit deficient. So I'm going to bring this in just in a little way, like to add almost like a spice to my life, or a micronutrient, if you will. I'm going to take some calcium, magnesium to add here, and it's a breath practice. It's a solo breath practice. Or now that you're distinguishing these, I can see that there's something in the relational realm. Okay, how do I bring that practice in? And so rather than looking at like these four table legs or chair legs as like, okay, I have to do them all the same amount all the time so that, it's an even chair, it's go like, they just need to basically rise together to create a stable foundation. And that part of the reason I want to distinguish these is just because you might start to notice like, oh, I could feel that something was wonky and I didn't know why, but now I have a place to look. So I want to give, before I sign off here, first of all, I want to give you, again, any time to ask questions or offer shares or any way to make this more applicable to your life. Secondly, I want to give just a couple of examples in each area. And any of you who have practices in any of these four areas, like, bring your examples too. Like I have a whole other live I want to do about the importance of a community of practice. So in this moment, we're on the live together. Let's just consider that we are a pop-up community of 10 or something like that, and we're practicing together in some way. So how do we be generous and share your best practices with each other? And then a little process, just kind of, it could be reflection, it could be a journaling process, but to take a look at where this is at in your life. So again, there's also overlap, and I just want to acknowledge that. I don't think I'm going to go super deeply into the overlap, but you'll start to see it as you start to look at like, well, what are the practices, or do I have any practices, or, oh, this is a practice, but I wasn't doing it completely consciously. Now I can bring a little more intention and consciousness to it. And so there's definitely overlap between, something might be a solo practice and a spiritual practice, or it might be, solo and then it can be brought into the relational, right? There are all these ways that they totally interplay, but I find that there's value in distinguishing them so that you can start to look at, where do I need to bring more in, or where maybe am I a little heavy on one side, or where like how do these play together? Even if they're happening at the same time, maybe you're going, so starting with like some examples, right? Like personal practice might be a body practice, might be a mind practice, might be a breath practice, might be some combination. But I consider, for the most part, for instance, I went to a yoga class today, like a yoga asana class, although my teacher never lets us stay at the level of just asana. And I've, again, been very, very lucky in that regard. But even though I'm going to a class and there's probably 20 other people there, for me it is mostly a personal practice. And certainly if I do yoga at home, even if my children are around, there's other ways in which that becomes somewhat interpersonal in terms of how I set boundaries or how I relate to them. But when I do that as a practice, like yoga asana, it's personal. It's a solo practice. So, and then meditative practices are like this. There are, and honestly, my work in creating an authentic world the circling practices in terms of carrying those practices forward has largely been around creating what I would call interpersonal meditation, which I could be totally wrong about this. I would be really curious actually to hear about other forms of interpersonal meditation. Most of the forms of meditation that I've become aware of in my life have been solo. So that's a big one that tends to be a solo practice, which obviously impacts other areas of our life. But the practice itself is around the self, or the non-self, if you will. And that might include breath, or it might be awareness or attention, or, these various things. So those are versions of solo practice. There are breath practices that, although sometimes we might do them with other people, are solo practices. You can do things like Wim Hof. You can do, there are just different, there's just breath awareness, right? There's body awareness, but those are ultimately bringing our attention to ourselves in some way. And of course, ideally, in some way, it's to expand beyond, but it's really about the importance of self-reflection. People talk about meditation in the sense of it's like brushing, instead of brushing your teeth, you're brushing your mind, or you're doing the laundry of your emotional, psycho-emotional self. But it's a solo practice for the most part. Now, interpersonal practices. So again, and just to really recognize that there's overlap here, is there are ways and times that my yoga asana practice is also very connected to God, right? Or I might devote my practice to source, or I might, there are these things where then there's some overlap in it, and it might shift my practice. And it might be both, or it might be I'm doing the yoga asana practice more as a spiritual practice or more as a personal practice. So interpersonal requires more than one person, can be a group. Again, circling is a form of this. Most authentic relating practices, and in some way I would say also nonviolent communication, a lot of just communication practices in general can, at their basis, I would call them interpersonal practices. And then there's whether you take that on in a consistent way, or you just learn it in your mind, right? Well, this would be a good idea. Or you go great, am I gonna practice that? Not just when there's a intense moment coming up, or am I gonna find a way to practice this regularly with the people in my life? So it can look a lot of different ways, right? There could be something that we used to teach a lot as authentic relating was around there was curiosity practices or curiosity exercises or games, and one could actually do that every day with a friend or with a partner, and then that would be kind of a practice. How do we actually stay curious about each other? Not just have the intention, but actually set something in place. Something else that I'll often teach is around praise practice, especially between romantic or sexual partners, and setting aside time, not just oh yeah, I just need to praise that person more, and having kind of that intention and trying to do it, but going hey, let's set aside 5 minutes, every morning or every night, and we're going to get 2.5 minutes each, or we're going to sort of tennis ball back and forth, ping pong, right? That's ping pong. The ball goes back and forth, and you're going to say something that you praise or acknowledge me for, and then I'm going to say something, and when 5 minutes are done, we're going to bow and go on our way. And that has an impact. It has an impact in the moment, of course. It might feel good, or these kinds of things, but it keeps that the same reason why we might do a solo meditation, or we might do a solo yoga asana practice, that also these practices for our interpersonal relationships, they need upkeep as well. So, another one that would be a personal practice, but sometimes can become relational in a similar way, is gratitude practice. Some people journal every morning about gratitude, or they journal every night about gratitude. That's a personal practice. And then it's kind of combined almost with a praise practice, but I've assigned people, or I've known people to do have a gratitude journal that both people write in. And I've actually done this with friends, not specifically gratitude per se, but actually I have some friends that we're artists together also. And and where we've made books, really simple books, and we'll send them back and forth and write to each other and then send it. And sometimes, months go by in between, and sometimes it's very short. But in that way, it becomes this kind of relational back and forth practice. And again, and if you ever come to any live event I teach, or any other way of working with me, really, that will bring some form. I mean, authentic relating is just like this umbrella term that just means like, hey, how do we be the most full, most real versions of ourselves with each other, in a given moment? And it's an ongoing practice. This is why I call it a practice. It's not a become perfect at, or I've done it and done. It's something that just is ongoing. Partly because we change, but also because this is, moment to moment. This is our life. And a lot of times we need to create framework around practices like breath practice, to the point where, I still get thrown by things in life. I've been incredibly overwhelmed the last week in really managing my home and my life with my children and dog and partner, and then my mother's been in the hospital, and that really threw this whole curveball. And I got angry at first. Like I couldn't just focus on work the way I like to. And then I'm able to meet most moments with like, okay, great. So like I started this live with slowing down. I have a lot of breath practice under my belt. So they say, and that means that I'm usually able to just draw on it when I need it. In a way, asking for help is a relational practice. And there are ways to do that in a more ongoing way, so that then again, when you really need help, like it's there. Or so there are these definite, and then there are sexual relational practices, and some of them involve like actual sex or nakedness or intercourse, and some of them are bringing things like breath practices that we may work with personally now into the interpersonal realm. Well, what is it? I can do my own sort of meditative breath practice alone. Now, what is it actually to sit like with my partner, for instance, on his lap or on their lap, or knee to knee, or holding hands, or finding some way, and then to find a way to breathe together. Or some of you have practiced different forms of 3-part breath with myself or with John Wineland and I. And so what is it when we now bring this into the interpersonal realm? So again, there's like these overlap, but it's helpful to distinguish, well, what am I doing right now? Am I sitting across from another person, but actually doing solo practice? Or am I really making this relational? So earth-based, place-based, I've talked, throughout this live in various ways about certain things that I do think are related to earth-based practices, which again, sometimes like some of it is starting with some research and actually finding out like, okay, well, if I follow my bloodline, if I follow my father's bloodline, if I follow my mother's bloodline, if I follow the ways that goes, like, where do I find myself, like literally on earth? And what were the earth-based practices of the people that I come from? And what were the earth-based practices of the people who lived in closer connection with the earth and the seasons and the rhythms and the plants and the animals actually where I live? Especially, I would say, for anyone who's sort of intends to stay anywhere for a long period of time, that's a very deep and valuable inquiry. For me, not only do I plan to stay here for a long time, but I've been here a long time. I've been in this exact spot for like 6.5 years. And then I've been in this area for 10. And then I've been, just barely broadened out for another 15 or 20 beyond that. And then, but I can count the miles basically that are my range that I have lived within. And I have basically lived within Sonoma County to Big Sur, and then, a little bit inland from there, but all up and down the coast. Like that's my range. That's where I've lived my entire life. So it is really important that I felt like, well, what is this land? Now, some simpler way, so that's like a research-based way to get connected. I would also say that, I don't know, I'm afraid I'm going to lose people with things like this, but I think this is really important. So you can always get connected to a tree. other plants as well. Now it's a little tricky, like seasonal plants that will die and may or may not come back. So I often will say a tree because trees stay for longer. So I have women who have worked with me in the past who live in San Francisco, like live in a city, but there's a tree that they're connected to, and that tree, and they actually go and they have, again, it's ritual, it's practice. They take the time to go to this place, to be in actual relationship with a being that's not a human being, and that they can go and you can take this, you can take this really far. I have asked trees questions and I have gotten answers. I've asked freaking rocks questions and gotten answers before. So, so again, I might lose you here, but at whatever layer you can actually connect to this, I encourage you, I just deeply, deeply encourage you to find some way to connect to a way in which you go like, yeah, I live on planet Earth. I was born on this planet. How can I actually get to know this planet more deeply? Where I live, where my people came from. Some of that, now earthing is like a thing. I'm like, that's just called freaking walking, like our ancestors. Every single one of them. I don't care if you're first generation immigrants. I don't care if you've lived in this country for a very long time or whatever country you live in. I don't care how sort of disconnected you are from your land-based ancestors. We all have them. And every single one of them at some point walked barefoot on the earth. Every single one of them had to connect to the plants and animals in order to survive. Every single one of them knew the herbs in order to create medicine. Every single one of you has that connection. So, yes, putting your bare feet on the ground actually is really valuable. And you can just do it. Like I would encourage any of you who are like, I don't know what the fuck this woman's talking about. I would say, are you willing to try? Are you willing to put your feet on the earth, once a day for 2 weeks, for a month, and then just go and just be curious, like, what happens if I do this? What happens by simply taking that time and connecting to the earth in that way, or sitting under the same tree? And again, if it's not every day, maybe it's 3 times a week. You could do it for 1 minute, you could do it for 5 minutes, you could do it for an hour, but who's got the time? That was, just a side note, that was my very first blog that I started when my son was 1 year old, and it was called ... but who has the time? Because I was like, who's got the time to fucking like write or read this shit? So all these things, like, who has the time for all this practice? Really, we have to make the time. We have to make the time if we want the benefit. But it does not have to be an hour a day. So that, again, that's a whole other Facebook Live. Hi, Amy. I was so happy to see your name pop up. I love you. But these are all earth-based practices. These are ways, and maybe it's that you sit on your front porch. I do this. And actually, it was my daughter that really, I did it before in certain ways, but she sort of reminded me again. I'd gotten out of the habit. So I did a 90-day Kirtan Kriya meditation practice, which is this Satanama. So here you go, solo practice, spiritual practice, and I made it into kind of an earth-based practice because I would do it on my front porch a lot. So, I can put a link to Kirtan Kriya in the comments, but it's sort of irrelevant. But I used to go out every night, and I would sit in the evening. My kids would be asleep, and I would sit on my front porch, and I would do my meditation. And in that way, I sort of brought it into the realm of what else is going on. I actually had raccoons come up, and it kind of freaked me out because I'm a little scared of raccoons. Of all the animals, most animals I'm not, but I'm like, oh my God, like they, anyway, they could have rabies. So the 2 raccoons were on my porch, or I'll just hear the birds, or there's, other things. Like a lot of times we have a lot of hawks that do a lot of nesting. So I hear that going on, and I would make this practice. And then my daughter really wanted, I'm always trying to get rid of things, and my kids are always trying to get things, bring more stuff into our lives. And I like things too. I shouldn't blame it all on them, but our neighbors were giving away this rocking chair, and I was like, no. And my daughter was like, please, Mama. She literally went and sat in the rocking chair on the street corner. And I was like, well, I don't want her sitting on the freaking street corner in a rocking chair. Like, fine, we can have the rocking chair on our front porch. And she would go sit in the morning in this rocking chair, and I was like, that is a really good idea. And so I started, I would put breakfast in front of my kids. And so this requires, right? This is what makes these things practice. It requires intention. In order to have the time to do that, I have to make their lunches the night before. If I don't make their lunches the night before, it's less likely I will have time in the morning to sit on the front porch with my cup of tea and literally just pay attention to what is happening in the world around me outside. What are the birds that are coming in? What are the sounds? What is the wind? What is the weather? What is actually happening on Earth? So I believe this is an incredibly valuable table leg of practice, is in some way finding a way to be connected to Earth. And the last one is connection to God, connection with Spirit, to the divine. I would say, it's very hard for me sometimes to know, I'll just be really honest here, to know how to speak into the realm of true atheism. Because I have never felt that way, and it feels very, very foreign to me. So I hope I'm not offending anybody, but I imagine that even in the realm of like true atheism, that you could connect to, if I say source, like some people may take that directly out to like, sort of a God, divine, but this all began somehow, right? I mean, we can call it the Big Bang. There's probably newer theories that I'm not even aware of, but there is a source. There's literally a creative source, and there's a spark, and life and the universe and planets and stars, and like, so source. And I believe, again, whether you have that feeling like God, and whether that's very, very clear, like you can say God very easily, or whether it becomes a little different with the divine, or source, whether that's in a kind of a very spiritual way or even a more scientific way, that the willingness to be in relationship with that there is something larger than us. And clearly even larger than, just Earth, right? Like we're this one planet inside, not even just this solar system, but inside this galaxy, inside like, I don't know, infinite galaxies. It's sort of, when I really tap into that, it blows my mind. And so again, wherever that is, and I say it very distinctly as relationship with the divine, relationship with God, relationship with source, because I think that is, this, I don't know if I want to call it a two-way street per se, but that it's that sense of finding a way. Now, how do I practice with this? Some people have prayer practice, and that might be, so in one way that's like sending out, but also there can be that sort of asking and receiving. I know prayers in some way are like, please for me or my family or my this, but also that sense of even allowing for some guidance that's beyond our own. I mean, I teach a lot about intuition, and it's really important, but there's also a way that can become very self-referential. And then of course, we can ask other people, like, please reflect me to myself. That's interpersonal practice. I will literally say to people sometimes, will you please tell me what you think I should do? I want your opinion. Please give me advice. So, sometimes we just want to be reflected in a more objective way. And then sometimes I'm like, would you please, I said it just the other day, I was like, so I'd like to just tell you what's going on, and I would like you to tell me what to do. Or like, are you willing to do that? And thank God, because it was really helpful. So I think we can do that with source. I mean, I think we can do that with, I already said this, right? With like a tree or with the earth, and then see what comes, but also this question of like, what guidance or wisdom do you have for me today? Is there anything that you want from me today? How can I best serve life today? How can I best serve love today? How can maybe you have other words that are important for you, but even asking for that, and then just seeing, let go if this feels edgy for some of you, and like, oh, I don't know if I want, direction from God or source, or what are they going to say, or can I follow it, or can I trust it, or this kind of thing. Is like, you could even take it on as a practice, and just with a lot of clarity, like, look, for 1 week, I'm going to ask every day, but I may not follow the advice that I get, or I may not follow the direction, but I am going to listen, maybe I'm going to record it just so that I can actually, go back and go like, holy shit, that really, like, it really said that, or I really had this vision, or there really was this guidance. And I chose not to follow it for very good reasons or what have you, but actually there was some sort of dialogue. And then again, this is where overlapping practice can come, right? So dance, for instance, could be kind of a solo practice. And it can become bigger than that when we're willing, when we offer something like that to the divine, or we offer it to source. In the Buddhist community where I grew up, we would offer the merit of this practice too. And there's sort of this idea of all beings, like I offer the merit of this practice to the awakening of all beings. And that's, depending on where you're at, or where, you know, these things, in some ways you could take that at a very like literal level of like humans, I offer this to the awakening of all humans, or it's all beings if you see beings as wider than that. Even Buddhism, like I know some people are into Buddhism because they think that it's less like woo-woo than some other religions, but I spent enough time in that community to see, like, you know, there's also just this, they're talking about like, you know, the 10,000 Buddhas in all realms, and it gets a little out there. So again, I really say I believe strongly enough in the importance of practice that I want to invite you all to like take any of this on from where you're at, and don't think that you have to change who you are or what you believe, or, you know, these things in order to find some practice within each of these realms that works for you. And if you leave any comments, you know, I will come back and I'll do my best to assist with that if I can, or if you want it, I guess. So one of the things that we also used to do in the Buddhist, I mean, they still do, but when I was there, so one of the things is, you know, we do ceremony every day, several times. And at meal times, we actually offer food to like Buddha. And the representation of that is literally whatever we're going to eat. We take a little bit of each and we put it into these 3 tiny little bowls, and it's literally taken to the altar in the meditation hall and offered. You know, all over India and in many, many countries. I visited India, so that's why I reference India, but in many, many countries, there's practice. I'm trying to come up with a different word than that because I want to sort of define it, but all that really means is like consistent ritual, right? Ritual over time with attention brought to it at the same time every day, or in the same way, or, you know, with intentionality of making an offering in some way. So again, a lot of these can overlap. I see it's like there are people who would make offerings to trees, right, as divine beings, or just as beings, or and so what I think that so the last practice that I want to give you, or this little chunk, is if this is something you want to work with in your life, I would encourage you to start. You know, you could make like a pie chart, make a circle. I mean, you could kind of do it just by taking a piece of paper and putting 2 lines. So you make 4 quadrants. I just like circles. So you could make a circle and do that, or you could do it on a square piece. And just in, you know, in the corner of each one, right? Like, you know, personal or solo. How else did I name this? You know, connection with self, individual, personal, solo. And the other one would be connection with other, relational, interpersonal. And another one would be earth, land, place-based, connection with earth. And then the final one would be connection with source, God, the divine, or cosmic practice. And then would be, there's a couple things you can do with that. The first one I would say is probably to go through and actually just rate yourself with no judgment, no blame, shame, judgment, none of that, but just like scale of 1 to 10, you know, how expressed am I in this area of practice, you know? And for like, maybe you get high numbers in all of them, or maybe they're kind of low, but it's all the same in all of them. Or maybe you're like, in one area, like you're just rocking it on the personal practice. You've got all these, you've got meditation, you've got yoga, you've got breath, you've got, who knows, you've got journaling, you're just doing all that, and you're like 10 out of 10. And then the idea of connection to earth is kind of a new one to you. And you're like, oh, that's like a 1 out of 10. I kind of do that. Like I have this noticing of this, or I plant some flowers, but I have never really brought conscious attention. And then, doing all of them and just going actually where I'm at right now, not where I want to be, not what I think would be good, not what, but just like if I'm just honest, if I get the honest lay of the land where I actually am right now, with the understanding that actually orienting myself with honesty allows me to create a more accurate map to where I want to be. Just like rate yourself 1 to 10. How full is your practice, or how fully expressed, or how solid, or how consistent, like just kind of in that realm, like where do you fall on all 4 of those? And then from that is looking at like, okay, well, what might need to shift? And again, it's just this honest inquiry without necessarily any, you don't have to make any commitments yet. It's like, well, to be, to create more kind of balance, or I think it might serve me if I added more here. And again, there might be some honesty required. I might actually need to shift a little bit of the time that I'm spending on personal practice into relational practice for a time at least, or as an experiment, or, just given what my life looks like if I'm already doing 5 hours here, I'm not sure I can add another hour here. I'm kind of exaggerating, but you might find that there's something to that. And you might start to notice like, oh yeah, okay, this is how my table of practice is wonky. And this is what it might take to bring it into a little bit more alignment and a little bit more wholeness. And then I would invite, before you even necessarily come to, a comment about, well, what about this or what about that, is like, just list out, see if you can get at least 5 in every category of just options that you could do, either that you already do or that you could do in any of those areas. And if you're really stuck, come back into the comments and be like, I couldn't come up with a single practice for blank, or, you said this, but that just sounds too weird. Like, do you have any other suggestions for, how to make that less weird? Or, and I don't know if I'm going to be helpful. I'm kind of weird, but I will try. I will try my best. And I think the last thing I want to say, and then I want to check in with the comments before I go, is that it's really, really, really normal. I don't know if I've met a human, especially, I know some now, but there's very few humans, even ones who are actually quite developed in certain areas of practice, who don't lean more to 1 or 2 than the other 3 or 4. Almost all of us have some preference, and that preference either comes kind of as a direct habit from how we grew up, or almost as like a rebellion to it. It's just common. And also some of them just feel more comfortable. And so, many people are sort of more comfortable with the interpersonal, and they're like, don't like to sit alone still in meditation, or more comfortable. Some people are just way more comfortable. They're like, they would so much rather relate to God than other humans, right? Or these other things. So I think I just want to really acknowledge how normal that is, how common it is, and that even those of us with a lot of awareness around us, if we don't pay attention, if we don't bring our conscious attention to this on a regular basis, we'll often fall to one side, or to kind of 1 or 2 of these, and be like, oh, I completely forgot that that other one was there. I was hoping it would just get carried along. And in ways they will, because they are somewhat connected, but over time you will always see the deficit that gets created by not truly bringing all 4 into your life. So I want to just check in here. Oh, thanks. Maria said it was great to see me live again. I know I've taken a bit of a break. I've been really, I'll just put a little note, because you said that, is I think one of the reasons that I'm really fired up about practice right now is I've been looking at like, well, how do I want to bring what I teach? What is the right way right now? And one of the big things that I'm working on is creating a women's membership collective called The Collective. And I'm sorry, males of the world, right now that's my focus. John and I do the Art of Fearless Intimacy weekends and our salon, and those are both co-ed. And I am looking at creating some other things that are either co-ed or even potentially just for men. But right now, my focus is really on this women's collective. And one of the things I'm looking at is like how important it is as humans, yes, but as women to be able to come together and practice, actually, to like have a container inside which we look at all these different areas and how they impact our life. And so as I've kind of stepped back from the way that I have been doing things, that had me also step back from lives in the way that I was doing them. And I realized, this is one of the reasons, like practice and having a container for practice and having a community of practice I just think is essential. And it's hard to know how to do that in kind of the global network that we live in now. So this is part of my response to that, is really creating a global women's membership called The Collective as a place to come and do this work together. So anyway, thank you. I'm glad you like seeing me live. Libby said, I agree with this. I think as you create a practice, it takes a lot of effort, but eventually if you practice enough, it gets in your muscle memory. It goes from practice to habit. Yeah, I mean, I really want to do a live of distinguishing between like habit and practice, but I get what you're saying. I think we actually agree where it's like it becomes easy. It becomes in flow. It's part of the kind of normal rhythm of our lives. And most of you have probably had the experience where you can do something consistently, and then I don't know, you lose sleep because your kid's up, and you get it gets out of your routine, or you go away on vacation and it gets out of your routine, and then like coming back is like, but that thing was so easy. I was journaling every day, or I was exercising 3 times a week, or I was getting, like, why is it so hard? So it's kind of about like the rhythm, like getting it into the rhythm of our lives. And the reason that I want to distinguish a little bit is like, well, most of us, I hope, have a habit of like brushing our teeth. And it's nice that it happens without thought, but I do think that one of the things that sort of elevates something from habit and doing something which is quite easy, like brushing your teeth, but to making like a practice is a different level of intentionality around it, and the kind of awareness, rather than just like, yeah, I'm supposed to do this. I think if we do that with certain, like what I would call practices versus habits, we lose some of the value of them. But I actually think that's just a semantic piece. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Libby. Lorraine said, I love your work, Kendra. It's so great. Oh, thank you. Well, I love praise, so this is helpful. Thank you, Deborah. I'm glad that this was supportive to you. And then Libby said it again. I say that boundaries are a relational practice. Absolutely. And consent is also a practice, and cherishing each other and other kinds of interpersonal rituals. Absolutely. So again, even inside of each of those, you can break it down into what is the actual practice. So if boundaries is kind of like a broad thing, it's like sometimes, I've given some people who've come to work with me the practice of saying no to everything first, and then being able to come back and say yes, or to say, I need to think about that, like to put a pause on everything as a way to even find where are their boundaries. So I would say that like when I call something a practice, I want to say that it's very tangible, and you can say, did I do it or didn't I do it? And sometimes with boundaries, it's like, wait, did I set a boundary? Do I know what my boundaries are? They can be a little broader, but you can put those practices in place. Like if there's somebody you're having a hard time setting boundaries, I'll say, then you don't answer the phone when they call you, and you wait, and they leave a message, and you listen to it, and then you go, okay, when is right for me? So that's a practice, right? In relation to this person, the practice is that I don't just answer the phone and then get thrown off because it interrupted, quote unquote, they interrupted whatever I was doing. It's like, no, you interrupted it by picking up the phone. So yes, absolutely. And consent and boundaries, again, are somewhat related in that way, cherishing each other and looking at like, well, how does this other person actually feel cherished? And how do I feel cherished? And so how do we put those things into practice? Absolutely. So beautiful. Okay, great. So those are the comments for now. Again, if you come back and you leave more after we're done or you're watching the replay, it's always nice to just, give a wave and say hi so I know you were here. And I'll definitely come back. I always so deeply value and appreciate your attention. I know that your time and your attention are valuable. And it's such a privilege to be able to speak about things that are so deeply important to me. So thank you. Okay, ciao for now.